Now, I've been preaching through Nehemiah in the evening service, but because of the preaching schedule and because I'm here physically, my time at the evening service will be a bit more spread out, which is why I've decided to complete Nehemiah here. But for those of you who may not have been following the series, I will try and make it into individual standalone messages. And of course, I'll try and keep you updated and update you and keep you to speed as we go along. Now, as you may have read before in your own Bible reading, you know in the book of Nehemiah that he had returned to Jerusalem from Persia in order to rebuild the walls. These walls had been destroyed many years before, and they remained unbuilt for 90 years. And as a result, God's people, they were mocked, and each time they tried to rebuild the walls, they were opposed by their enemies. And so Nehemiah returned. He returned by God's providence, and he inspired them to build. And when they did build, once again, the enemies threatened to destroy them and to destroy the walls. Now, these enemies that we read here in our text were Sanballat, and he was the ruler of the Samaritans in the north. There was Tobiah, he was the ruler of the Ammonites in the east. You had Geshem, he was the ruler of the Arabians in the south. And you also had other enemies, such as the Ashdodites, who were in the west. So Israel was surrounded by their enemies. And because they almost completed the walls, the enemies, they increased their attacks. When they increased their attacks, the people of God doubled down again, and they worked hard. And what we learn from this is that Satan is always very eager to destroy God's kingdom. He's working very hard. And if he can't destroy the kingdom from without, through persecution, he will try to do it from within, through betrayal, through treachery. And this is what we want to see here today: betrayal and treachery at Ono. So we will consider these methods that the enemy used. So firstly, we want to see that they isolated the man of God. Secondly, they defamed the man of God. And thirdly, they attempted to betray or defraud the man of God. And these points are printed for you in your notes. So firstly, the isolation of the man of God. So Nehemiah was a man of God. He came to glorify God by rebuilding Jerusalem, and his enemies were not happy. And when he first came, they used derision. They mocked him. They said, you're going to build this wall? A fox will climb up to the wall, and it'll be broken in no time. The materials are bad. The workers are bad. You are bad. So they mocked him. But when the wall was half built and there were no breaches, so the perimeter was completely built, that's when they tried intimidation. They surrounded the people. They were threatening to attack. And now, when it was finally fully built, they tried isolation. So derision, intimidation, and now isolation. Verses 1 and 2, which we just read, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the rest of the enemies, they heard that the wall was built. There was no breaches, the perimeter was all built except for the gates. And so what happened is they sent representatives. They intensified their opposition. And these representatives that they sent by Sanballat and Geshem, probably like a servant or messenger, they told him through that messenger, come, let us meet together at Ono. Now, of course, the name of the place itself should have given him pause to say, oh no, I shouldn't go there. Of course, he didn't speak English, but Nehemiah knew full well the treachery that lay ahead. And so he knew that they thought him mischief. That's what the verse says. And the word mischief can be translated as harm. They thought to do him harm. So when mockery, when intimidation didn't work, Let's try assassination. Take him, isolate him, trap him, kill him. Now, how they made it sound was they made it sound very nice. They made it sound like a meeting of governors. You know, you are a governor of Jerusalem, I'm a governor of Samaria, I'm a governor of Ammon. Let's come together. And even the location that they chose was quite lovely. Ono was by the coast of Israel, on the Mediterranean Sea rather. And, you know, it was a ploy to drag him from Jerusalem, you know, where he was unbathed when, you know, with all the rubble and all the dust, drag him to another place where he would be refreshed. I mean, how many of you at this time especially wouldn't mind an all-paid vacation to the Maldives? You would, right? But Nehemiah knew full well not to take it. He knew something was up, and he declined their invitation. You see, the meeting itself was a change of tone. Before that, it was great hostility. They mocked him, they derided him, they intimidated him, and all of a sudden they want to meet. And so he knew that they wanted peace, diplomacy. But if they were going to offer peace to him, what would they want in return? They would want him to stop building the walls. They would want him to compromise. And this is something that he could not do. And if he did not compromise, he would be in danger. And he knew this. So how did he deflect this? In verse 3, he turned them down the first time. He says, I'm sorry, I can't come because I'm building the wall. It's too important for me to leave it. If I leave it, the wall will be unbuilt, and I can't do that. And so he responded by continuing in the work. He was not distracted. But they didn't give up easily. Verse 4 tells us they asked him 4 times. So if you can imagine, all the way from Samaria, they sent a messenger. Nope, goodbye. They went up another time. Nope, they went back up another time. So 4 times. And each time, he answered them the same way. I can't come. I'm building the wall. It's too important for me to leave it. So he deflected them by focusing on the work. Hands on the trowel, hands on the plow, hands on the brick, hands on the sword. He didn't let them be a distraction. And of course, I'm sure there is a lesson to be learned from this. In times of trouble, intimidation, trouble within the church, to continue to labor for the glory of Christ. Now, when they couldn't trap them or trap him, they tried a second tactic. That's the second point. They attempted to defame the man of God. Now, in verses 5 to 8, they sent an open letter. So on the 5th attempt, they sent an unsealed letter. This means that anyone could read it. You know, it's the equivalent of social media posts today, right? You just put it up there, everyone can read it, people may actually even believe it. Now, the letter had some very terrible things in it. Now, Sanballat the Samaritans were half-siblings of the Jews in one sense. So he sent a messenger, and essentially this is what he said. He said to them, look, Nehemiah, we're the same. You believe in Jehovah, I believe in Jehovah. You worship Jehovah, I worship Jehovah. You may worship in the temple, but I worship in Mount Gerizim, but we are brothers. Now, it's not in the text. I'm using sanctified imagination, but this is the tone that he was trying to achieve. He said, we are very concerned for you, dear brother, because the heathen, they're accusing you, not us, the heathen. And Gashmu, or Geshem, he is the one who confirms this. Now, what's the accusation? The accusation was this: Nehemiah, you want to rebel. You want to be king. That's what everyone is saying. You have even hired prophets to declare you to be king to all the people so that they would see you as king. So this can't go on. We're going to tell the king, we're going to tell the real king of Persia if this is not stopped. So let's try and solve the problem. Let's come together. Let's talk about it. Let's get to the bottom of this. Now, how did Nehemiah answer these false charges? Well, he responded very courageously. He sent back the servant with these words in verse 8. There are no such things done as thou sayest, but thou feignest them out of thine heart. Now, these things, basically, what Nehemiah was saying was not true. It's just your imagination. So Nehemiah responded courageously and plainly, even as he had before. But make no mistake at all. Nehemiah, even though he responded courageously, he was afraid. Nehemiah was, would you be afraid? I'd be afraid. Nehemiah was afraid. At first, when he answered plainly, I can't leave the wall. Now he was saying, you're dreaming it up. But make no mistake that he was afraid. He knew the trouble that he faced. And the reason why we know that he was afraid was in verse 9, it reads, for they all made us afraid, saying, their hand shall be weakened from the work, and it be not done. So he was afraid, so afraid that he had to plead with God. In verse 10, now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. Now this is a prayer of desperation. Now, admittedly, the words, O God, are not found in the Hebrew. But it is very clear that he was uttering a prayer to God. When they asked him, Nehemiah, come to Ono, he said, oh no. And now, when they threatened him, he cried, oh God. Now, when they didn't succeed with the isolation nor the defamation, they tried a third tactic. They tried defraudation. Now, it is a word. It is a word. They tried to cheat him. They tried to betray him. Now, Nehemiah had his own Judas. Not one, but many. And that's a third point. They tried to defraud him. In verse 10, we read that Nehemiah paid a visit to a friend, Shemaiah. And Shemaiah was a prophet. Now let me read this. Afterward, I came unto the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabeel, who was shut up. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee. Yea, in the night will they come to slay thee. And so Shemaiah pretended to be a friend. He's pretending to care about the welfare of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, they're coming to get you at night. They want to kill you. Let's go to the temple. Let's lock the big temple doors behind us. Let us go in so that you can be safe. And immediately, according to verse 12, Nehemiah knew that Shemaiah was not his friend. He said, I perceived that God had not sent him, but that he pronounces prophecy against me. Why? Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He was a prophet who had been hired to trick Nehemiah. And in verse 11, he said, should such a man as I flee? And who is there that, being as I am, would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. Now, this was a man who understood his place. He knew that God had not sent the prophet because no one except for priests were allowed into the temple on the pain of death. So if anyone tried to go into the temple who was not a priest, what would happen? You would have the gatekeepers, the doorkeepers, the temple guardsmen. They will come and they will run you through with a sword. You don't really see that very plainly, but that is what happened. You had temple guardsmen. They were Levites. This was the job that they were given. Kind of makes you rethink that verse, I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God, doesn't it? All right? But this was their job. They were protecting the house of God. Now, if he didn't die by going into the temple, he even said it that I will be a reproach. No one will ever work with me ever again because I have overstepped my boundaries. And that is why he knew that Shemaiah, who was a friend, was a traitor, and he was not sent by God. So how did Nehemiah respond to this? He responded to this by committing them to God. Verse 14. My God, think thou upon Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and on the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets that would have put me in fear. Now, this reveals so much, doesn't it? This one verse here, it tells us that his enemies were not just Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, and the Ashdodites. His enemies here were his friends. Shemaiah the prophet, Noadiah the prophetess, and the rest of the prophets. These were God's people. This was treachery. It wasn't the heathen trying to destroy him. These were people on the inside. God's people meaning to do harm to God's people. And, we may look at this and we may think this sounds like an impossibility. This should never happen. This never happens. But you know what? It does happen. You remember Abner and Joab? You can kind of think to yourself, Joab coming up to Abner and saying, Abner, I love you, and stabbing him. You may even think of David and Ahithophel, my familiar friend, my deep friend, who has betrayed me along with my son Absalom. And who can forget Jesus and Judas, someone that he was with for 3.5 years. But instead of taking revenge, Nehemiah asked God to deal with these people who meant to do harm to the kingdom. And so, yes, those who serve God will receive opposition. That's one of the applications from this passage. The man of God will not only receive opposition from without, he will receive opposition from within. His motives will be called into question. He will live in fear. And this is the experience of so many Christians, especially those who live in countries which are persecuted. Those who try and serve God and live for Christ, and the government is opposed to them. They are persecuted and prosecuted. And so for such a person, he must commit his enemies to God. My wife was recently rereading an article or an account. You remember there was a lady, a family actually, husband and wife, who lost their 2 sons in a freak accident where a lorry ran over them. They were Christians, and it was so difficult for her to live for Christ and to forgive. And she did eventually forgive. And all the netizens would say, she's weird, she's strange, what kind of demented person would ever do this to forgive the lorry driver who ran over the heads of her kids? She found it tough to do. But it is when her husband forgave first, and she saw that example of Christ in him, that she also committed the lorry driver, to Christ. Not in the exact same way as Nehemiah did, but she did not take revenge. Neither did Nehemiah. And Christians do not take revenge. We commit to God. And so we realize that kingdom building, we realize that Christian living is difficult. There will be plenty of discouragement, and that's how it is. And so to office bearers here who may be discouraged, soldier on. To those who serve in various ministries who may be discouraged, soldier on, because Christ will strengthen you. And this was the prayer that Nehemiah had. Strengthen my hands, O God. One of the saddest things as we read at the end of Nehemiah 6, not only were his enemies the prophets, his frenemies the prophets, but also the people of Israel who spoke well of Tobiah. Why? Because he was related to this person, who was related to this person, who was related to the high priest. And so, because of these connections, what is it? Blood is thicker than water. So he was doubly opposed. So to those who serve in this capacity with opposition, we soldier on. To those who are mocked for their faith, children, you choose to live for Christ. You choose to obey, to tell the truth in class. You're mocked. You choose not to give your life to the same things that your ungodly friends are giving their lives over to. You are mocked, but we soldier on. And as we look at this, that is one application, but that is not the only application. To focus on that application alone is insufficient. I believe that this was written for our benefit, that we may look to the greater Nehemiah. And what providence it is that we can consider that, because we are coming to the Lord's table. Our Lord Jesus met with opposition. Herod tried to kill him as a child. His brothers mocked him. The Pharisees tried to stop him. They devised many tests against him, saying that he had a devil. But what did Jesus do? He put his hand on the plow, on the trowel, and he continued to labor on. What were his famous words repeated over and over again? My meat is to do the will of him that sent me. So he went and he was busy teaching and he was busy healing. And when they couldn't trap him, they tried to defame him. The Pharisees called him a sinner, a drunkard, a glutton. They trumped up false charges against him, and people believed it. They got false witnesses to testify against him, that he threatened to destroy the temple, that he violated the Sabbath, that he practiced sorcery, and they plotted to kill him. When the false accusations could not stick initially, they schemed with a traitor, someone from the inside who came with, of all things, a kiss. So when we think of the God-man, the greater Nehemiah, we remember that he was a man of sorrows. Although he was with his disciples, we know that he was also frequently isolated. He was frequently alone. He could not trust those around him. Even in preparation for the Last Supper, he only told a few disciples so that the larger group did not know where the meeting would be. When he came, the devil tried to trap him alone in the wilderness. When he was at the Garden of Gethsemane, his friends forsook him, and he was all alone. And when the soldiers came, he was betrayed by a familiar friend. And at the cross, he had to bear the sins of the world alone. He was alone, and he was isolated so that we would never be alone. On the way to Gethsemane, right there, Jesus knelt down and prayed between Jerusalem and Gethsemane on the roadside, and he committed his disciples to the Father. At the cross, he committed his enemies to God. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And when he was betrayed, he allowed himself, he knew that it would happen. He allowed himself to be betrayed so that he could save us who would betray Christ at an instant, if not for his grace. And he was betrayed so that we would be brought into a family where we should never betray one another ever again. You know, we were once enemies of God. We were once enemies of one another, natural enemies of one another. But we are now, as the Bible tells us, at peace with God, and we should be at peace with one another. And so many times we've got harsh words towards one another, snide remarks, deliberately choosing to misunderstand one another in conflict. But Jesus stayed the course. He was betrayed so that we who are his children should never betray one another. Even when he was at Gethsemane, under such pressure, he put his hands now no longer on the plow or the trowel, but he put his hands on the cross and carried it through great heartache to the place of Calvary. And that is why we who are his servants expect nothing less. And he strengthened himself by going to God. He prayed that his disciples would be strengthened. And so, because it is the Lord's Supper today, as we come before it, perhaps the application to us should be that we need to remind ourselves what Jesus had gone through for his enemies, that he was isolated, defamed, and betrayed and defrauded. And in this world, God's enemies, the enemies of the church, will do this to us. But this is something that we should never do to one another. And because we live in this world with all of its heartaches, that is why we look forward to heaven, where we will have that greater supper, where he shall wipe away every tear. And let us remember, too, that when we partake of this supper, Christ our Lord is with us, together with the people gathered here, your brothers, your sisters, the ones who love you, who are loved by you, people who are not our enemies, but people who love and serve Christ together with us.